Hi, I'm Guy Lawrence, and you are listening to the Guy Lawrence podcast. If you're enjoying this content and you want to find out more and join me and come further down the rabbit hole, make sure you head back to guylawrence.com.au. Awesome, guys. Enjoy the show. Dean, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, I ask everyone on the show, Dean, if you were on an aeroplane and a complete stranger sat next to you and asked you what you did for a living, how would you reply to them?
I actually don't like it when people ask me what I do for a living because it is not easy to be able to describe what I do if I don't have the person already calibrated.
Yes.
So what I usually say is I'm a scientist. I know that the next question is, oh, what do you study? And then I think, oh boy, now I still have to answer the question. So if I don't know the person at all, I have no way of knowing what they're interested in, I'll say intuition. I study how we know things without knowing how we know them.
Yeah. Amazing. So if I was that person sitting next to you on the plane and you said that to me, I would absolutely, well, like I'm about to today, is fire a lot of questions at you. Mm-hmm. When it comes to something like intuition, because it's the unseen, it's almost, does science take a stance if we can't see it, it's non-existent? Or is there now, are they more open to these things?
Well, intuition from the point of view of forgotten expertise is acceptable to study. And so there are many really good books on these topics, and it's widely recognized that anybody who's been in any given profession for a while eventually learns much more than they're consciously aware of. So when you say, well, this is intuition, then everyone says, oh, okay, I can kind of get that.
Yeah.
If someone imagines that that's what I study, I will probably go along with it, even though that's actually not my primary interest. If I have a reason to believe that they're really interested in it, then I might go on and say, well, there's at least two forms of intuition. There's the forgotten expertise, and then occasionally people will talk about getting a download from who knows where. They get an inspiration or an idea, and it doesn't seem to be related to their prior experience. They may not have known anything about it beforehand, but they get an idea. And what's important is that they know something with certainty that it's correct. So this is slightly different than ordinary intuition. Ordinary intuition is like a hunch or a gut feeling, which is kind of vague, but you may or may not follow it. But what we might say is a noetic type of intuition. The noetic element of it carries a sense of certainty that the information that you're getting is in fact correct. And more often than not, in fact, it is. So this is a little bit more curious because, well, where did that information come from? And that's then the starting point for where we are interested in intuition.
Yeah, beautiful. I love it. And I love that to explanation. It's funny, I don't know how well you know Australia, Dean, but I live in a place called Byron Bay, which is northern New South Wales. And I promise you, every other person says they have a download every other day. It's that kind of place, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's a very normal conversation. But if I was living in the city of Sydney, in the hectic CBD, you know, it would be very different from that. So
right.
With it's almost like then, is it a forgotten skill set that we just don't use? Or Western society has not allowed us to sort of tap into?
I think one of the things that Western society is very good at is providing distractions. So I think it is inherently part of being aware. Like we all have these capabilities, but we're distracted by so many things and we run by the clock most of the time that we generally are not taught to pay attention to these other forms of intuition. I would imagine, and I suspect that it is true, that in indigenous societies where they don't have constant cell phones and all the rest, that it is considered to be much more natural to pay closer attention to what's going on inside your head and how it's reflected in the environment. And so for people that I've talked to who live in indigenous societies, they don't have any problem at all with the kind of intuition I'm talking about. In fact, they rely on it. Their lives may depend on it. So we are all capable of getting better access to a more comprehensive form of intuition, but we're distracted, so we don't.
Yeah. So I was curious because you've just sparked. I've still got questions to cover, but you've sparked a couple of great things in there. So would you fair to say where you place your awareness, then, and awareness being consciousness, it's almost like if you start to learn to where to place your awareness, you can start to develop and tune into that intuition and develop it.
Yeah, which this is why when people say, how do I get better at this? My first suggestion is meditation, because that's what it's all about. It's about attention training.
Yeah.
And historically, we know from, especially from the yoga literature, that if you're a diligent meditator, you will begin to encounter all kinds of interesting mental phenomena, which from the ancients, they would have called it siddhis, in Sanskrit meaning special power. In English, we'd call it psychic phenomena.
Yeah. Do you think then people are becoming more open to this?
I think so. We did a survey recently, which did not show up in my book, Real Magic, because we did the survey afterwards. But in the survey, we asked people within the United States, in the general population, and also a subset of scientists and engineers, how often or ever did they have certain kinds of experiences that were not described as psychic, but the description would require a psychic experience. So, for example, we might have one of the experiences might be that you felt that you were in communication with somebody at a distance. You knew their thoughts or their feelings. So we labeled that telepathy, but we didn't use that word. We just said, did you have an experience of this type? So we had 25 different experiences that people commonly report. They have various labels, which we call psychic. And so we asked two questions. One was, of these 25, which of these have you personally experienced? And then from that, we were able to tell whether they had at least one such experience, one of the 25. So among the general population, 94% of the people responded that they had at least one of the 25 different kinds of experiences. So this is extremely common in terms of experience. What you get when you ask questions about belief, especially belief where you use the labels that are psychic labels, like do you believe in telepathy? You get very different answers, because some people are thinking, well, they're going, I don't know if I know exactly what telepathy is, but they'll give a different answer. So we were specifically then asking about what have you experienced? 94% of the general population. So then we looked at the subset of scientists and engineers who answered this question, and we expected, well, most scientists and engineers are either not interested in these things, or at least not taught about them, or even taught that they don't exist. So we thought we'd get a much lower percentage, but in fact, we got 93%. 93% of scientists and engineers who do that as their profession have more or less the same percentage of experiences that we would call psychic as the general population. So is this common? Yeah, it's extremely common. What's not common is the serious scientific study of these experiences.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why don't they look at it more?
Well, when you try to figure out then how could we account for something? How do we account for telepathy? What first comes to mind for scientists in particular is, well, it's probably carried by something like electromagnetics. So it's a form of mental radio, because we know about electrical activity in the brain, and we know what electromagnetism does, so we imagine, well, it must be something like that. But when you actually work out the models and see, is it plausible that somebody from Australia to the United States could have a telepathic experience from the point of view of electromagnetics as the carrier, the answer becomes almost certainly no. It just doesn't work. And so you keep working through these kinds of models through how do we account for precognition or clairvoyance or all of the other psychic phenomena. We don't know from a scientific perspective. So that immediately puts it into a field which is very controversial, and scientists generally don't like to do things that are controversial because you immediately get people pounding on you. So that's one reason. It's too hot to touch. The other reason is that there's very, very little money available to study these kinds of phenomena. So even though there are a lot of people who experience it and find it interesting, science takes place today based on funding.
Yeah.
And so there's enough funding to keep about 40 to maybe 60 scientists working on these problems around the world. But 40 to 60 people, while they can do interesting work, you can't advance the state of the art very quickly. And it's by no means mainstream. It's way out on the edge of the mainstream. So we have a paradox of a vast majority of people having experiences of these type, which they find interesting typically, and almost nobody actually studying it. It's very strange.
Yeah. I believe it though. I believe it. If there's anything like the health industry I've just come from, Dean, there's definitely a biasness there. Like
There do. Yeah.
So do you fully trust your own intuition now?
When I remember to pay attention to it, yes.
Okay.
But I'm distracted like everyone else. So it takes a certain degree of effort to pay attention to intuition. Yes.
Yeah.
But when I get an intuitive hit on something, yeah, I definitely pay attention.
And then you go all in, yeah, because it can be hard to trust. I feel. I had the gentleman Bill from he made the documentary, the PGS movie.
Oh yes, yeah,
yeah, and he was talking about how he actually just followed his whole intuition for the first time in his life to make the film, and it was wonderful, and it turned out more beautiful than he could ever imagined. When we try and let go of that control a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, the downside of following your intuition is that because it's not like a normal cognitive, it's not something you can figure out. It's not rational. You can fall into a rabbit hole in the process because now you can start interpreting everything that happens to you as an omen, right? So everything becomes intuition, and that's not good either. So you have to be open to these impressions, but also use some rational assessment to make sense of it. Otherwise, you can get lost in it.
Totally, and then you're putting your power from yourself to something else,
right?
And then it becomes hope, right?
Right.
Yeah. So what I'm curious with, I only found out the other day that you were a violinist.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how does a violinist end up studying consciousness? Like, where was that transition come from?
Well, when I entered college as an undergraduate, by that time I was probably playing for about 15 years. So I was doing professional gigs, and I imagined that might be my career, to be a concert violinist. But I found it difficult physically to play for many hours every day. I just didn't have the stamina that it takes. And no one during my entire training ever said that being a professional musician is like being an athlete. You're making your living with your body. So if you have a robust body and can do it, well, then great. You could play the 4 to 6 hours every single day. I find it tiring. I found it difficult to do that. So I asked around among my colleagues and friends of my parents who had different kinds of jobs, what's a good job to start out with in terms of the degree, not the job, but the degree that you should get at college if you don't know exactly what you want to do. And so almost uniformly, they said engineering. So I said, oh, okay. Well, fortunately, I was good at math and science, and so engineering was easy. So I basically switched from a career in music to make it a hobby and rather focused more on an engineering career track, which I persisted through getting a master's degree until I realized I didn't want to be an engineer. So at that point, again, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I went on to get a PhD in psychology because I'm interested in everything, and that at the time was the thing that was most interesting.
Yeah, beautiful. And I read somewhere as well, Dean, that you heard with colors. Is that correct? Or was
you broke up just a moment when you were saying it, so I didn't hear it.
That you were hearing the music with color?
Oh yeah, a synesthesia. Yeah, so I can evoke that when I want to now, but after playing for many years, I somehow naturally associated certain pitches with different colors. I still kind of do. I have to put some attention on it, but I didn't realize until many years later that not everybody would tune the violin according to the color of the sound, because that's how I did it. I assume, well, that's how you do it. Well, turns out that that's not usual. So I just didn't know that.
Wow, that's incredible. And then how did you know that it wasn't unusual? Like, at what point did you realize?
Well, I'd never asked anybody in the orchestra what they were doing. We'd all tuned to some common note, like an oboe or something that would be playing the right note. And occasionally I was feeling, oh, that's flat. Like the oboe is flat, or it's sharp. You know, what are we doing? Okay, well, you go along with the rest of the group. But I also found oftentimes in listening to music, and this was long before we had things like auto-tune, so they weren't correcting pitch,
Right.
that I couldn't listen to some orchestral pieces or to pop songs because it was just off key. And it wasn't much. Typically, it could be off by a quarter tone even, and it would just feel grating to me that this is flat and it doesn't sound right. And in retrospect, it was because the color, didn't have the right color associated with the tone. So I guess it was the first time I heard about the word synesthesia that I realized that you could have a mixture of sensory input. And then I realized, oh, well, that's what I have. That's not normal. Well,
So
kids
it's
don't
amazing.
know.
So
And
as you're hearing it, you're physically seeing the color as well.
no, it's actually more like feeling the color. So, for example, if I was tuning an A on the violin, it's a certain kind of blue. Now, I didn't see the blue. It's not, but it has qualities of blueness. I don't know exactly how to explain it,
Yeah.
but there's a certain blue color or feeling that is associated with the right tone. And the same goes for a D string was orange, and the G string was green, and the E string was kind of a silver color,
Yeah, right.
but not color as much as like a feeling of the color.
Yeah, interesting. And do you think having that experience kind of led you more into studying what you study now? Because that experience is beyond the kind of spectrum of reality that most of us interpret the world from, right?
Well, but remember, this wasn't unusual for me, so I didn't know for many years that this wasn't common.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's what sparked it. I think, if anything, it was that I grew up in an artistic household because I was primarily playing music, and my dad is a sculptor and a commercial artist his whole career. My brother, although he's a dentist for the past 40 years, he's also simultaneously been involved in drama for many years, either as an actor or as a drama coach in high schools. So most of the efforts in my family have been along the lines of art. And what is generally seen is that artists and creative people in general are way more open to the strange forms of intuition, especially psychic phenomena, than people who are not quite so creative. So I was always around people who didn't have an automatic skeptical or cynical reaction to discussion of these kinds of phenomena, even though I don't ever record anybody in my family ever talking about it. No one ever talked about a telepathic experience or precognitive dream or anything like that. I found all of that information from books.
Okay. Yeah. And how long have you been looking at this work for now, Dean? Just out of curiosity.
42 years.
42 years. Amazing. And what do you think has been the biggest surprise so far of all those 42 years that you've seen? Go, oh, wow, that's just blown my mind.
The biggest surprise is my career.
Right.
Right? Because this is not something that there's a career track. You can't go to a university and learn how to do this because there's no career. There's no money in it. And there's a lot of social pushback. So somehow I've managed for the majority of my professional career to be paid as a ordinary scientist, except I'm focusing on these particular phenomena. So that's a miracle already.
Yeah.
So I get lots of requests from students and even faculty in different universities on what do I do in order to do what you're doing? And in some respects, I can give certain answers to that, but in others, you have to figure it out for yourself because you can't go to a school and learn how to become a professor in this topic because there isn't any to make it up.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. I wanted to touch on consciousness, and was something I find fascinating, and the more I've started to delve into this kind of field, if you like, is how our consciousness can affect the physical matter. From your experience, how much do you think we influence our physical reality from our own where we place our awareness, I guess?
Are you talking about influencing the body, the physical body, or beyond the body?
Both, probably, actually. They're both great topics.
So within the body, the field of psychoneuroimmunology is the fancy name that's used to talk about placebo effects and mind-body connections and so on. Much of that will probably be figured out in mechanistic terms. So the mechanism of action for why a certain thought or feeling affects the rest of the body, they're slowly figuring that out. It doesn't require anything probably beyond our existing scientific worldview. But the moment that you go beyond that and you say that I can mentally influence your physiology, even from California to Australia, then we need to think about other kinds of models. So when I'm asked, how does it work? How does any kind of psychic phenomenon work? It was thinking about that topic for many years and thinking about scientific ways of making models about what's happening and seeing that most of those models just don't work very well, which is why this is controversial. I started looking for clues in other places. Like, science is roughly 400 years old, but there are other worldviews that have been around from the beginning of recorded history. So one of the primary other ways of thinking about reality is the esoteric literature. And when you look at that, either from the Western perspective or the Eastern perspective, what you end up with is a worldview where consciousness is considered to be fundamental. What that means is that consciousness is more fundamental than the physical world. In other words, that the physical world as we experience it, and we're talking about physics and hard stuff, our bodies and so on, from the esoteric traditions, those are emergent properties of consciousness itself. So this is, from a philosopher is okay with this. A philosopher would call it idealism. That's the name of the philosophical stance, that everything ultimately arises out of consciousness. What science is based on is materialism, which is the flip side. So the phrase I use is materialism is the idea that everything is made out of matter and energy, including the mind. This is the popular notion within the neurosciences, that the brain and the mind are identical. And also, the brain gives rise to our self-awareness, to consciousness. That's the scientific way. From the other side, the idealistic viewpoint, everything is made out of mind, including matter and energy. So you can see that it really flips on the other, it's like turns it upside down. So, and thinking about then, how do I respond to the question, how does it work? How does telepathy work across the globe? How does some mental intention affect something at a distance? It's very difficult to give a persuasive answer from a materialistic or scientific worldview perspective. It's very easy to give an answer when you use an idealistic worldview. And as I said, the idealistic worldview is the esoteric tradition. And so I looked in great detail at both the Western and Eastern esoteric traditions to see if it really did provide a clue as a way to think about these phenomena. And of course, it turns out that it does. That's what my book, Real Magic, is focused on. It's taking another kind of way of thinking about reality and saying, if that were true, then what would we expect in terms of what can happen mentally? So that threatens to go into a very long riff now on consciousness and its various properties. But the first thing I want to say before we get into that, if we do, is that as a scientist, I'm completely aware of the power of the scientific worldview. We would not be able to do this conversation. We have a video conversation completely on the other side of the planet. It's almost in real time, and it's a beautiful picture. Well, an idealist is not going to develop a system that does this. You require pretty heavy-duty materialistic ideas in order to figure out how to do these technologies. So by saying that I'm entertaining the idea of philosophical idealism doesn't mean I'm rejecting materialism. In fact, what I'd rather do is propose that we adopt materialism because it works, but we make it more comprehensive.
Yeah.
We make it comprehensive in the direction by saying that if you think about the hierarchies or the way that science carves up reality, it carves it up in the way that you would look at an academic, like a university. Each department is a way of carving up reality. So you go to the science departments, you find physics at the bottom, and then above that is chemistry, and then biology and psychology and so on. There's this hierarchy of ways of carving up reality. All I'm proposing then is that there's actually something below physics. The esoteric traditions say it's consciousness, it's awareness itself. If we put consciousness as a layer below physics, then what it means is that somehow physics as we understand it is emerging out of this more primordial substance that we'll call consciousness. And then everything above physics is exactly the way we already understand it. So we're not changing science, we're adding something new to it to make it more comprehensive. And when we do that, then the notion that the mind can transcend space and time makes a lot of sense because it comes before physics.
Yeah.
And the idea that the mind can influence things at a distance also makes sense because, again, physical world emerges in some way out of consciousness. So what I'm trying to do is to make a mashup of both idealism and materialism, taking the esoteric and the scientific and bringing it together in a way so it doesn't deflate idealism, it doesn't get rid of the esoteric lore, nor does it get rid of materialism, but it makes actually something better out of both.
Yeah. It's almost like we all need to become united just to figure out the truth.
Yeah. The moment you constrain what you're going to consider to be true, you're almost automatically going to be losing something.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in integration of ideas rather than saying, well, no, this is right and nothing else can be correct. Because I figure if an idea has been around for 10,000 years and it's still around, there's probably something true underneath that. And so we should pay attention to it.
Totally, totally. I mean, I've never even said this on the podcast before, but whilst meditating, and I've been meditating for quite some time now, Dean, and I've had some really interesting experiences, you could say mystical, that really deconstructed every single belief system that I didn't even know that I had growing up as who I am as my identity. And then when you start to have that and they become just as real as the reality we have now, then it does make you question, well, what's going on? You know, which triggered my hunger and thirst to start looking at this and actually get a really grounded explanation. Because I think the more people learn about this information and start to embrace it and use science as a language to understand the things that might be esoterical initially, and combine those things together, it really gives us great peace of mind as well. And it's allowed me to live my life the way I want to without this much fear holding me back. Do you know what I mean? Like it's
well, for some people, it will give peace of mind and an expanded sense of who and what we are. Other people respond not so well to it because they get this expanded sense and then they're afraid to tell anybody because they're afraid that they're going to be thought to be weird or something like that. And a lot of people are called names like that because we're, as social creatures, we have to fit in with the crowd. And so if you have experiences that blow your mind, and now you have to somehow convey that to your friends who haven't had that experience, you could end up getting shunned, which is deadly. People, it's really bad to have that happen. So people learn typically early on that you can have these strange experiences and you don't talk about them for fear, and realistic fear oftentimes. And all that does is it sustains the taboo that there are certain things you're not supposed to talk about, even as our survey showed that way above 90% of everyone does have these experiences. But the taboo says don't talk about it. Well, that's a pity. So one of the goals that they have in mind is to break the taboo So at least we're able to talk about these things.
Totally. That's right. And I think you mentioned something right at the start about labeling. And I think we subconsciously label so many things and then we make a choice before we even actually looked behind it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment that word comes up, we just have these automated responses. Oh, that's hocus pocus. Oh, that's this or whatever. And it keeps us, I guess, closed down from allowing any more information in. I think, the wisest, a wise man once said to me, Guy, live life with a beginner's mind. And I always embody that. And
Right.
just think of that curiosity.
Yeah, and this is true of many scientists as well. So I'm similar to stereotypical scientists in that I'm really driven by curiosity. I just want to know things. Anything I find that's interesting, I want to dive into it and learn it somehow. And yet you find very quickly, and at least within the academic tradition, that you have to start constraining. It's like wearing blinders. Certain things are okay to dive into, and certain others you cannot, at least not professionally. And so I thought, well, this is one of the reasons I'm not in the academic world anymore, because I found that just annoying, really. That we're supposed to be able to, at least within that context, the academic context, to be able to discover anything and study anything. It's just not true. And it's not only not true within the kind of studies that I'm interested in, but oftentimes business interests and political interests will constrain what people are allowed to study. And I just think that's wrong. Yeah. So I did work in the academic world for quite a while, and then I decided I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, good on you, mate. That's wonderful. With your book, Real Magic, then, what topics do you cover in there? What could somebody expect if they were to go out and buy your book after listening to this?
Well, what they shouldn't expect, especially given that the subtitle is includes the phrase a guide to the secret power of the universe. So I've had a few people read the book and then they write a review saying, he doesn't talk about the secret power of the universe. Well, yeah, I do. It's consciousness, not so secret. But if somebody is expecting to see a book of spells or a long lineage and saying how you can become extremely wealthy by doing nothing other than thinking about it, that's not what it's about. It's giving a context, a historical and a scientific context for how we could understand the nature of magic that is not Harry Potter magic, it's not fictional, and it's not stage magic, it's not illusions, but real magic. And the real magic is all about the nature of consciousness and what it can do. So for people who are interested or have the notion that occasionally something very strange happens to them, like a synchronicity or something, or a telepathic experience, and curious about how do I make sense of this, given that it doesn't seem to fit in with what we've been taught, that's where the notion of real magic comes into play. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah, beautiful. And would you be able to share, and now I heard you had a bit of a synchronicity with a fellow scientist, was it, a few years back?
Kind of.
Could you share that story with it?
Yeah, so I talk about this in the book.
Okay.
I think I'll precede that with another synchronicity that I was reminded about today that I hadn't thought about, but I should have put this in the book too. So the notion, this is related to the idea of manifestation, that you want something, you have no idea how you're going to get it, but if you're extremely clear about the goals and you put focused intention behind it, and you just desperately want that, but then you release it, right? You release the intention, so you're not grabbing onto it. So you just say, okay, universe, figure out some way of doing this. So this came about because this is now about 10 years ago. We were doing an experiment where we were testing a claim of many advanced meditators, where they would say that after a while, they get into a place where they feel as though their location is expanding out. They describe it as a sense of spaciousness, like they're no longer located here, but it's like it moves out, not only in space but in time as well. They get a sense of timelessness. So we said, okay, let's see if that's just an illusion, Maybe it's just something that is like a hallucination in a meditative state, or maybe it's real. Well, it's hard to test if somebody is expanding out spatially. I mean, when you look at them, they look like they're still right there, but maybe there is a sense in which they're expanding in some way through time. So we did this experiment, it's part of, I talk about it in the book. It's called presentiment, and it looks at how the brain responds before a randomly selected stimulus. And so it's before a stimulus that you can't predict. So it's by definition a kind of precognition, except it's unconscious, it's in the brain. Right. So we worked with 8 advanced meditators, each having a daily practice of at least 20 years, using a form of meditation called non-dual, things like Dzogchen and other non-dual, where you get into a state where there's no distinction between now and then, or you and me, and that sort of thing. So these are all highly experienced people with that. We took their EEG, and the stimuli are very simple, little light flashes or audio tones in their ear at random times. So we had a huge amount of EEG data. And now I'm thinking, well, I can figure out how to do the analysis, but it'd be much more efficient to use standard packages that are used in the academic world by neuroscientists to study EEG. And the standard out there is called EEG Lab, which is used in thousands of neuroscience labs around the world. And in order to use EEG Lab, you need to have a software package called MATLAB, which is a well-known scientific and engineering package, basically. So I know how to program. I could have figured out how to use MATLAB. I could have then figured out how to use EEG Lab and done the analysis myself. But I thought it would be more efficient to find someone who knew something about it already. So I was imagining I would find a student who knew MATLAB and was willing to learn EEG Lab, and then maybe they could do it. So I was complaining to to my research assistant and saying, well, I don't know how to find somebody like that. Where am I going to find a student who, first of all, wants to learn and is willing to spend free time doing this? So she said to me something I thought was important. She said, well, what do you really want? Not just a student who could figure it out, but what would you want ideally? So it forced me to become very clear in terms of what I wanted. So I said, well, what I really want is somebody who is a bona fide neuroscientist, probably an academic, who knows EEG Lab up and down and sideways, who is willing to do this kind of work for free. That's what I want. 2 days later, I get an email from somebody who I'd met at a talk I'd given some years before. He said he wanted to come up and see our lab. So I said, okay. So about a week later, he comes up to the lab, and it turns out not only does this guy know how to use EEG Lab and is interested in our project, he's the one who wrote EEG Lab. He's the creator of it. He's the person who goes around the world teaching people how to use EEG Lab, given that he's the one who wrote it in the first place. So he's now been part of our staff for the past 8 or 9 years, because he now, and he even moved. We see him every day. So this was a case where I wanted something. And once I became very clear about what it is that I wanted, he wrote an email. Like he said afterwards, he just got a sense that he should write to me, roughly around the time that I became clear on what I wanted. And sure enough, he was the one who ended up doing the analysis and publishing the paper, and we've collaborated on many papers since then. And I don't have to learn anything about that software because he's the one who wrote it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And do you think those synchronicities happen more when we actually, we get clear on something, but then we let it go? We just detach?
Yeah, it's a combination of extremely clear outcome that is possible. So that the possibility of it is important as well, because if I had a very clear outcome that I wanted to get a solid gold-plated Mercedes to show up in my driveway, that's mine somehow. It's possible. It's just not very likely. Yeah. So you have to, it's like each of us has a golden coin, and the golden coin gives a wish. Well, you have to use it wisely. You do something that is not outside the realm of possibility, or at least is, I think everything is possible, but more like, some things are more likely than others. So it's possible that once I got very clear on this, that somebody I meet thousands of people, they could be inspired somehow. And so you can bring things together in a way.
Yeah.
So that's an example, one of many, where I've kind of reluctantly got to the point where I realized that with a very clear intention of something that is conceivably possible, with very strong motivation behind it, I really want this, and then drop it. Like let it bubble into your unconscious somehow by not dwelling on it, and then it happens. So.
Does meditation help with increasing the chances of the synchronicity, like getting beyond yourself in those meditative states? Do you think?
I think it does, but after a while, you don't even need meditation. Right. I think the clarity of intention is more important than the meditation. But knowing how to meditate is also important because it helps you get down to these deep consciousness states where I think the action is actually happening.
You got it.
Right. So it's not like surface level, I want stuff. It's the want somehow is allowed to drift down into a state of awareness where you're much closer to the source of consciousness, like the primordial consciousness that we're talking about. And that's where things start to happen, not at the level of conscious awareness.
Yeah, beautiful. I found the more I've meditated over the years, Dean, the more I feel in a meditative state during the day. I just become more consciously aware of everything, you know?
Yeah, and that's what I meant then, that the meditation is good to kind of create a baseline.
Yeah.
But once you're there, part of you is meditating all the time anyway.
Yes.
So then clarity combined with that level of depth somehow works like magic. That's why I use that term in the book.
Yeah.
So we don't fully understand all of the details about why that happens, except for more of a metaphorical sense that maybe the consciousness we're talking about inside yourself, which I call little c consciousness, all of the esoteric traditions say that little c is identical to the universal C.
Big C, yeah.
A universal consciousness, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. Well, I love the work you're doing, Dean. It's just bloody fascinating, right? Now, I'm just aware of the time, and I ask a certain set of questions on every show, and I thought I'd change gears a little bit. And what's one of your low points in your life you've had, but later in life turned out to be a blessing?
I would say working in conventional jobs, either within the academic world or in industry, and becoming very depressed because I felt that this was not what I was supposed to be doing. And the depression became a signal for me to, first of all, realize what my passion actually is, and then figure out a way of doing that. So I oftentimes will tell people that you need, first of all, to figure out exactly what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, and do everything that is necessary in order to be able to make a living while following that passion.
Got it. And did that passion unfold as you explored it more, kind of thing?
Kind of. It was a matter of becoming clear on what it was that I actually wanted to do. So for an example, when I started working after getting my doctorate, I was at Bell Laboratories, which at the time was the largest technical lab in the world, and all kinds of amazing things were developed at Bell Labs. It was a great place to work. After a couple of years, I could see how I could easily have stayed at Bell Labs for my entire career. And I still have colleagues who have been there for 30 and 40 years and will retire after working at Bell Labs. The work I was doing was intrinsically interesting. Got to go around the world and do a bunch of interesting stuff. At exactly the same time, though, I was thinking, really? This is how I'm going to spend the rest of my career making a better telephone, essentially? And I began to get a sense that this is not why I'm here. This is a good starting place, but this is not where I should end up. And it was both simultaneously liberating and kind of frightening too, because I didn't know where I was heading. I just knew that it wasn't this. So yeah, I mean, it's the process of getting clues that this doesn't feel quite right. And I've had that actually happen many times.
Yeah.
Usually as a result of working in some place that other people would be salivating over getting a job. and my feeling, this is not exactly right. I need to keep tweaking it until I find exactly what feels right, and that's what I want to do.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I think more people need to hear that, because I know so many people, and I was there myself, that are in that circumstance, and it can be scary initially, but
Yeah, who's going to want to give up the golden handcuffs of a really good job?
exactly.
Yeah.
But it's the most rewarding thing you can ever do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What does your morning routine look like?
Let's see. My morning routine is I wake up at 7. I try to get out of bed at 7:30, sometimes 8. And then I do 20 minutes of high intensity interval training. That's my morning exercise. Sometimes, I don't always do this, but sometimes I'll add on another 20 minutes of meditation afterwards. I've been meditating a long time, but not in a row, if you understand.
Yeah.
And then I will sit in front of the computer for 12 hours. I'll occasionally stand up too, but the vast majority of my work involves writing, data analysis, that sort of thing, developing new experiments. So when I'm in an experimental mode, we'll be in the laboratory, usually putting together equipment of some type. And then once it's ready to go, I'll hand it off to a research assistant who will actually run people through the experiments. So that's typically how it goes. So this is 7 days a week. And people sometimes say then, well, why are you working every single day? And the answer is, it's not work. It is work. I'm getting paid for what I'm doing, but this is where my passion is. So I was like, I'm getting paid to do what I want to do.
Beautiful. Have you got are you working on any experiments at the moment, or is it all about the book at this point?
Oh no, the book is over. I mean, I've finished writing that a year ago already. Yeah, I'm working on 4 experiments. They all have to do with interaction between mind and matter. Some of the targets involved, the matter side is photons, and the other type of target, I'm using both entangled photons as a target, non-entangled photons, just regular photons, and also more recently electrical plasma as a target. So plasma is interesting because it's sometimes called the 4th state of matter. It's these highly electrically charged streams of plasma, like in a neon gas. You put a very high voltage charge on it, you'll get this nice looking dynamic stream, which is so energized that the electrons in the molecules aren't tightly bound to the neon. So the streamer itself consists almost entirely of free electrons. So it becomes exquisitely sensitive to electromagnetic fields and electrostatic fields and magnetic fields. The reason why you get these nice dynamic sinewy shapes in the plasma is because they're reacting to itself and they're reacting to the external world. We're finding then that as a target for mind to influence the system, it seems to be very responsive. It's also a lot of fun for people to do the experiment because it's like you're trying to interact with an electrical snake. It looks kind of like a snake, these plasma streams. So people get a sense that they're really able to interact with it.
Yeah.
And the data supports that. The effects we're seeing are not wildly big, but we're definitely seeing that there is a relationship then between the intention that somebody has for how the plasma should behave and what we're actually seeing.
Fascinating. I was only at a Joe Dispenza week-long retreat last week, and he was talking about plasma, of all things. Funnily enough,
Electrical plasma?
No, he just mentioned that he was very interested in plasma itself.
But it's plasma as in the body, because there's a liquid plasma.
Must be liquid plasma.
Yeah. No, that's like blood plasma. That's a very different.
Okay, got you. Than electrical plasma. Yeah. Got it. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone tonight, from any time frame and anywhere in the world, to have a conversation, who would it be and why?
That's a tough one. Does it have to be a real person?
It could be anyone or anything.
One possibility would be Mr. Spock from Star Trek. It's always been a favorite character of mine. I liked Mr. Spock because he was the stereotype of a completely rationalistic person, completely logical, completely rational, and yet he was the one who could do the Vulcan mind meld, right? So for him, the idea of some kind of psychic connection was not something that was irrational or non-logical. It simply is the way it is. So that would be a possibility. Similarly, someone like Yoda from Star Wars would be interesting to talk to somebody who had a pretty good command of the ability to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
For historical people, I'm tempted to say someone like Einstein, except that I probably would not be able to actually dive deeply into the physics because he was a lot better physicist than I am. So that may not be a very interesting conversation. Perhaps someone like Buddha. Or the man Buddha. That could be interesting, although I'm not entirely sure what language he spoke. So I'm assuming that in this fantasy, we get to talk whatever language we want.
Absolutely. It's just fascinating. He's come up a few times, actually, Buddha.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, beautiful. And last thing, out of all the topics and everything we covered today, is there anything you'd like our listeners just to ponder on, to think about, they could take away from this conversation?
Well, one thing is, sometimes you've already asked, what's the most amazing thing that you've run across? And in some respects, it is that the ideas about psychic phenomena, in particular magic, which is the psychic phenomena are magic. It's the same kind of thing. The idea that it's real. I mean, you have to put yourself in the position of a scientist who goes through a traditional university and has traditional training and all the rest of it. And you're told at minimum that this stuff is nonsense. And even more so that you should fight against it because it seems like a regression to the past, except it's real. So that's something like, for people who experience these things all the time, this is not a big deal. For me, it was a big deal. It took a long time for me to come to the point where I was actually comfortable saying that based on the scientific evidence, not so much my experiences, but based on the evidence that we can see in the laboratory, yeah, psychic phenomena really are real. That means that some elements of traditional magic are also real because traditional magic includes divination, which is all about clairvoyance and precognition, and it includes manifestation, which is about psychokinetic effects, and it includes an area we didn't talk about, theurgy, which is about communication with spirits. So it's on this third part, I'm not sure what I believe. I know that there's evidence on both sides. That I have limited experience in that third domain, but I know a lot of the literature. So I kind of suspect that some of that is true as well. That is a radically different worldview than the one that we are trained on.
Totally.
And yet it looks like some of it is real. So I think that deserves some serious contemplation, especially for people who are trained or simply accept the scientific worldview as being the only correct worldview. I think most of it is correct. It's just not big enough. And the nice thing, of course, about science is that it's not fixed in stone. It's something that will continue to evolve. And my prediction then is that it will evolve in the direction where it begins to converge with what we currently call the esoteric worldview. It will converge into something that is bigger than both of them.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. What a beautiful note to end it on. With regarding your book and your website and more information, where's the best place to send everyone?
Well, so go to deanradin.org if you want to learn more about me. And you can find information about real magic there, which you can buy in any bookstore. It's also in audiobook form and Kindle form.
Yeah, beautiful. I just bought it on Audible last week, so it's definitely on Audible, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Dean, thank you so much for your time and your generosity and sharing your wisdom with us today. That was a wonderful conversation, and it's certainly, I know it's got me thinking, and I have no doubt we'll get the listeners thinking too. So thank you so much.
Yeah, very happy to be here.
Thank you.